Then the SS guards were put to work burying the dead. They were made to. They got a lorry, and they then had to start this lorry without using the self-starter in the morning and physically pick up the dead. They were everywhere in piles around the camp, in the huts. Soon they had to dig more graves, huge graves. Those were the words of one of the liberators of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. As the Second World War came to an end, there were many different camps which would become liberated by the Allies, including the Americans and the British, as well as Soviet forces. But inside of these camps were many former SS guards who had treated the prisoners terribly. A number of these were attacked by the inmates, and some were even shot by the liberators in vengeful reprisal. It's impossible to understand what the prisoners went through, and to understand their disdain and hatred to the guards, but the Allies did execute a number of the guards for the fact they themselves were horrified by the camps that they had discovered and the corpses of the suffering that they came across. In this documentary, we look at the different reprisals that took place with the liberation of the concentration camps. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 12th of April 1945, officials of the Wehrmacht met with the British at a bridge at Winsen, and then in the evening an agreement was signed creating a 48 square kilometre perimeter around Bergen-Belsen, and this was declared a neutral zone between the Allied and German soldiers to protect the prisoners within Bergen-Belsen. With this agreement, most of the SS guards were allowed to leave the camp, but a few of them, including female guards, decided to remain to allegedly uphold order inside the camp. Women such as Irma Grazer and Elizabeth Volkenrath had the chance to escape, but they did not want to, instead deciding to risk it as they believed they wouldn't face any reprisal at the end of the war in Europe. In the days leading up to the liberation, hundreds were dying each day, and in April 1945, around 10,000 prisoners of the camp died. The British did not get to Bergen-Belsen until the afternoon of the 15th of April 1945, and they then liberated the camp. When they entered, as mentioned, 13,000 unburied corpses were found, and the prisoners, 60,000 of them, were suffering from no food, and they were sick from diseases such as typhus. Many of the liberators would get the disease too. A news reporter summed up the feeling at Belsen. He claimed, "Here, over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful, ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do, and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies have been born here, tiny things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." Guards were pressed into action, and the Hungarian forces were ordered to take control of the camp, and they replaced German SS guards. To begin with, only Commandant Josef Kramer was arrested, but the guards who had been hiding amongst the inmates were eventually turned over. Now, the British liberators, specifically Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, had stated to the former Commandant Kramer that for every inmate of the camp who was shot, one SS man will be executed. There were reports of rioting inside of the cookhouses, as some inmates were starving and were trying to get some food supplies inside one of the storehouses there. What came next was one of the first executions of the liberation. The Hungarian soldiers who had been placed in charge over the SS, and who, let's remember, were allied to the Nazis under the Axis alliance, then shot a number of prisoners. Some prisoners were killed by the Hungarians as they tried to put down the little riot, and one who was wounded was actually carried to the hospital block by Josef Kramer, the commandant himself. Hungarian guards also replaced SS guards inside of the watchtowers, and these were unlikely to fire upon the SS, as they had been previously allied to them. But the British thought that they were more reliable and less likely to shoot prisoners than the SS were. Hours after the British had entered Belsen, there was another bit of disorder breaking out in one of the storerooms, specifically in the clothing stores. The inmates were flocking to try and get some new clothes to wear, and the prisoners took possession of one of the empty huts in the SS compound, and to try and get them to disperse, the British Army soldiers fired shots well over the heads of the inmates to try and keep order. The prisoners then raided the pigsty at the back of Block 9 and slaughtered 50 pigs to try and get some food. They then continued on to Block 50, and inside of there were many tents, which were used for prisoners to sit under. But then came the reprisals. The angry and suffering prisoners were running riot throughout the camp, and in this they began to target many of those people who had kept them in submission for so long. Those specifically who were searched for were the prisoner functionaries, or Carpos as they were known. These were prisoners who were assigned by the SS Guards to supervise forced labour groups and larger groups of inmates, and someone becoming a Carpo was said to have been the biggest insult to the prisoners. At the end of the war, many Carpos were subjected to reprisals, including mass lynchings upon the liberation of the camps. Inside of Camp 2 in Belsen, and the barracks specifically, 7 Carpos were seized in the evening, and they were then executed, presumably beaten to death, or lynched, being hanged in public. But in the days following the liberation, further reprisal took place. On the 17th of April, also inside Camp 2, 7 more Carpos were found, and the former inmates approached them and beat them to death, leaving their bodies in the dirt. There was a further incident also involving Carpo Erik Zerdel, and he shot a female prisoner dead outside one of the blocks. A witness claimed that all I saw is Erik standing there, holding his neck, the girl lying on the ground, and a tall man running away. It is disgusting now. Everybody is sleeping with everybody else. Such things are all right in private, but together in the block it's disgusting. Zerdel would later be executed for the crime of killing that woman in an act of jealousy. With 13,000 unburied corpses lying all around Bergen-Belsen, the clean-up operation began, and realising they did not have enough people to bury the bodies quickly, the remaining guards who had been captured, including the women, were tasked to help clean up. Huge mass graves had been dug, and the guards were then ordered to carry the typhus-infected remains, and the corpses were so rotten that limbs came off. For some of the guards this was the ultimate humiliation, and the clean-up began on the 18th of April 1945. One of the SS men who was burying the dead actually took his own life, being another guard to die after liberation, as the ordeal was allegedly too rough for him, and he knew he would possibly later be condemned for his actions. But then some SS men believed the clean-up was beneath them, and 2 of them were shot by the British as they tried to escape. One of these was shot in the large water supply in the women's camp, and his body was eventually fished out. On the 19th of April, another one of the SS staff used in the burial detachments took their own lives, and another 2 made a break for it for the gates and the fences, trying to escape, but yet again they were shot by the British and killed, and their bodies would then be thrown into one of the mass graves alongside the prisoners of the camp who had died. It was on this day that 49 male guards and 26 female guards were arrested, and around 20 of them died in the following weeks, some from sepsis, and the majority died from typhus, contracted from burying the bodies. On the 20th of April, another SS guard was shot trying to attempt to escape. The guards had been placed on starvation rations and were not given protective clothing to deal with the bodies. The slaughter kept continuing amongst the prisoner population as they targeted the Carpos, and in total it's believed that around 170 of them, 170 Carpos, were killed, being beaten to death and being hanged in public around the camp, so that everyone could see that some form of vengeance had been carried out upon those who inflicted the pain and suffering. In the months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, there was a trial that took place, in which Commandant Josef Kramer and other guards, such as Irma Grazer and Elisabeth Falkenrath, were condemned to death for their work at Bergen-Belsen. These were then hanged on the gallows by British executioner Albert Pierpoint, but in the direct aftermath of the liberation, there were roughly 170 Carpos who were executed by the prisoner population in reprisal, and a number of SS guards who were shot by the liberators, most who were attempting to escape during the clean-up of the camp. Dachau was opened on the 22nd of March 1933, and to begin with it held 200 prisoners sent from Stadelheim prison and Landsberg, and it was the first camp to hold inmates who were regarded as political prisoners. As time went on and the Nazi stranglehold over Germany increased, thousands more people were sent there, including those who were considered undesirable by the Nazis. As soon as the camp opened, there were many deaths that occurred there and prisoners were being killed. The prisoners were forced to conduct hard labour, and it became a site where many SS guards were trained before they were dispatched to other camps to work. The prisoner entrance was marked by the infamous phrase "Arbeit macht frei," and the camp then became very overcrowded. It was a site which was synonymous with execution, as around 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were executed there by the Commandant's guards at the SS shooting range near to the camp, and executions of prisoners continued. Guards were known for their brutality, and they would beat and brutalise the inmates if they caught them not being productive enough, and they would execute and slaughter with their bare hands. Executions also took place at roll call on the gallows in front of the camp's inmates, and they would strike terror into the hearts of the prisoners. There was also a women's camp that opened in August 1944, but as the Second World War turned against the Germans, the conditions at Dachau went downhill badly. The Germans started to move prisoners from concentration camps nearer the front lines to more centrally found camps nearer to the German heartland, and with this thousands of prisoners were sent to Dachau. Because of this, there were many typhus epidemics and other disease outbreaks which caused problems, and there were poor sanitary conditions coupled with a lack of food and water. This led to many prisoners dying, and it's believed that around 15,000 people died in the final 6 months of the war at Dachau, and each day hundreds were succumbing to the conditions, as well as those who were being brought to the firing range to be executed. But in the final days of the camp, prisoners were still arriving, and the SS would confiscate food, which was given to the prisoners on death marches, and on the marches hundreds were dying. The SS would dump the bodies in a ravine and would force locals to bury them, but on the 24th of April 1945, days before liberation, the Commandant of Dachau ordered 7,000 prisoners on a death march from the camp. Those who would not keep up on the 6-day march were shot, but at the time of liberation 200 people a day were dying. Himmler would initially order no prisoners to fall into the hands of the enemy, and those from the northern part of Germany were ordered to be drowned in the North Sea or the Baltic, but at Dachau the SS began to erase any information regarding what was actually happening at the camp. But on the 29th of April 1945, soldiers from the 3rd Battalion 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, who were led by Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, began to approach the huge Dachau complex and the nearby subcamps. On their approach they came across 29 different train boxcars, which had 2,000 people's remains inside, and it was clear they had been brutally exhibited and executed by the SS. The smell of the rotting bodies and the sight of the emaciated dead caused a huge amount of discomfort, upset and horror with the minds and emotions of the American soldiers. This may have had an impact on the events that came later. But as the Americans approached, they ordered the SS guards to surrender, but some fired upon the Americans. As they pushed forward into prisoner areas, the Americans found more bodies who had been dead for some time, and they had just been left in the open with no dignity. But the soldiers then came across the prisoners who were alive and were dying. But then the decision to surrender the camp was made, and the majority of the SS hierarchy and the guards who had fled the camp had gone missing. One senior guard, Heinrich Wicker, was slaughtered by the prisoners after the surrender, and he was left in charge with 560 guards at his disposal. But on the 29th of April the camp was surrendered, and the job then came to try and save the lives of those who were starving. One liberator would state of the scenes, "As we approached the southwest corner, 3 people came forward with a flag of truce. We met them about 75 yards north of the southwest corner. These 3 people were Swiss Red Cross representatives, Victor Maurer and 2 SS troops, who said they were the camp commander and his assistant. They had come here on the night of the 28th to take over from the regular camp personnel for the purpose of surrendering the camp to the advancing Americans. The Swiss Red Cross representative said there were around 100 SS guards in the camp who had their arms stacked except for the people in the tower. He had given instructions that there would be no shots fired, and it would take 50 men to relieve the guards, as there were 42,000 half-crazed inmates, many of them typhus infected. He asked if I was an officer. I replied, I am Assistant Division Commander of the 42nd Infantry Division, and will accept the surrender of the camp in the name of the Rainbow Division for the United States Army." But regarding the capture of Dachau, Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, would issue a statement that said, "Our forces liberated and mopped up the infamous concentration camp at Dachau. Approximately 32,000 prisoners were liberated, and 300 SS camp guards were quickly neutralised." But the circumstances around how the SS guards were killed has been debated, and some historians have argued that the war crime was committed by the American soldiers. One historian stated of what happened that the Americans came on April 29th, a Sunday. Work had stopped in the camp on Wednesday, and an evacuation was being organised. One transport of 4,000 prisoners was able to get away, but the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered the 40 miles from the Danube faster than the Germans expected. At noon on Sunday the camp was quiet, and the SS guards were in their posts at the towers when the cry "Americans" went up. A prisoner rushed towards a gate and a guard shot him. Outside, a single American soldier stood looking casually at the towers, while the guards eyed him, and the others, who were 200 or 300 yards away. When the Americans opened fire, the guards in the gate tower came down, hands in the air. One held a pistol behind his back, and the first American shot him. In the next few minutes a jeep drove up. In it, a blonde female war correspondent and a chaplain. The chaplain asked the prisoners now crowding the gate to join him in the Lord's Prayer. Troops of the 42nd and 45th Divisions who liberated Dachau in the afternoon on the 29th of April were fighting in Munich the next morning, and by nightfall had, along with the 15 Corps, other 3 divisions, captured the city that was the capital of Bavaria and the birthplace of Nazism. But what actually happened with the executions of the Dachau liberation reprisals is best told by the men who were there and who witnessed it. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks stated that he saw around 50 German prisoners who had been captured, former guards, and that they were then taken to an area which had been used for storing coal. The area was enclosed in an L shape by a wall, which was around 8 feet high, and it was found next to the camp infirmary. The prisoners of war were watched over by American soldiers and a machine gun team, who had their weapons primed as a threat for them not to move. Sparks then left these soldiers, and as he walked away he heard a soldier shout, "They're trying to get away," and then machine gun fire was heard. Sparks quickly returned, and he came across a 19-year-old soldier, nicknamed Birdie, who was manning the machine gun, and he had shot 12 of the prisoners and wounded many more. The gunner was crying and was beside himself, and Sparks later said of the incident, "It was the foregoing incident which could have given rise to wild claims in various publications that most or all of the German prisoners captured at Dachau were executed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The total number of German guards killed at Dachau during that day most certainly did not exceed 50, with 30 probably being a more accurate figure. The regimental records for that date indicate that over 1,000 German prisoners were brought to the regimental collecting point. Since my task force was leaving the regimental attack, almost all the prisoners were taken by task force, including several hundred from Dachau. But there was some debate as to whether the soldier had been told to fire, or how many German soldiers or guards were actually killed. One witness testimony said that around 4 p.m. in the afternoon he arrived in the yard where the Germans had been shot, and that around 15 or 16 were killed, and the wounded were lying up against the wall. Some of the wounded were moving, and the surgeon and doctor did not know if any medical assistance had been called for, meaning that the Americans were happy to let the wounded suffer and succumb to their deaths and fates. But other accounts would go further, saying that the Nazis were rounded up and were executed along with their guard dogs by the American forces in the coal yard. There were further executions that took place, and the prisoners would get their revenge on the guards following the liberation. One prisoner stated that the prisoners swarmed over the wire and grabbed the Americans and lifted them onto their shoulders. Other prisoners caught the SS men. The first SS man elbowed 1 or 2 prisoners out the way, but the courage of the prisoners mounted. They knocked them down and nobody could see whether they were stomped or what, but they were killed. The prisoner functionaries such as the Carpos were also beaten and were killed being attacked with fists and other weapons. One German guard was beaten to death with a shovel, and there were further incidents in which the American soldiers turned a blind eye to inmates beating the former guards to death. One witness said that after an attack there was not much left of an SS guard's face, noting the hate the prisoners held in their hearts. But there was an investigation into the killings of the guards of Dachau, and witnesses came forward about what happened. Further information came to light regarding more deaths, with 4 German soldiers being shot in a boxcar, and these men had surrendered and they were given a coup de grace, which was given to the wounded. Also, further accounts about SS men being shot by the Americans in different enclosures were spoken about, and the investigation resulted in possible court-martials, but charges were later dismissed. It was considered a violation of international law, but no one really ever answered the charges for it. The Dachau Liberation Reprisals, as they were known, were a series of executions and killings of those SS men who were responsible for the huge suffering and evil that occurred inside of Dachau. They were people who were responsible for the thousands of dead at the camp, and they did little to help the suffering. But the executions that were carried out around the camp were a sign of the anger and horror that the Americans held these men in. It's likely that they were affected by the mass bodies and the horror that they encountered at Dachau, and this is why some of them turned a blind eye to the reprisals and killings. But inside of the liberated camp, between 35 and 50 SS guards were executed. Ohrdruf concentration camp was established in November 1944, close to the town it was named after. It was to begin with a forced labour camp before it became a subcamp of the Buchenwald complex. The camp supplied prisoners to work on a planned railway construction project and for a huge communications centre in the basement of the nearby Mühlberg castle. Prisoners had to connect the castle to the main railroad line and dig tunnels in nearby mountains. Around 10,000 prisoners were held there by the later part of 1944, and then months later, in early 1945, the total number of prisoners was around 20,000. There were no beds, but instead blood-covered straw infested with lice, and the prisoners were housed in huts, stables, and even tents. The workdays were stretched to 14 hours, and many prisoners died from the conditions of the work, as well as a lack of sanitary facilities and medical care. They also had insufficient food and clothes for the weather. The guards of the camp were helped out by those who were sent from Auschwitz to bolster the violent regime inflicted upon the inmates. Some historians believe that the prisoners were making a facility which would later be a testing site for a German nuclear bomb or for other wonder weapons. Those who could not work there were sent to other camps, but as the Americans began to arrive in the area around Ohrdruf, huge evacuations took place as prisoners were sent on death marches. During these marches, members of the SS and Hitler Youth killed roughly 1,000 prisoners, and mass graves were later disturbed as the SS tried to burn the corpses to reduce them to ashes and then conceal their crimes. The SS guards also killed many who would not walk and shot them in the open. There were also roughly 3,000 prisoners who died from the work inside of Ohrdruf, as well as the murder they suffered at the hands of the violent guards, putting a rough death toll on the short-lived camp at 7,000. On the 4th of April 1945, Ohrdruf was liberated by the US 4th Armoured Division, with Brigadier General Joseph Cutrona commanding, and also the 89th Infantry Division in support. But what the US soldiers found was shocking. One young US private said, "We drove in, and between the gates and the barracks were 30 dead, the blood still wet from the departing German guards. There were bodies piled up high in the sheds, and many were partially burned." The liberators were scarred for life with what they saw, and even General Patton, Eisenhower and Bradley arrived to survey the camp. Eisenhower claimed that the most interesting, although horrible, sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to the German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beg a description. When I was touring the camp, I had encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one route or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality was so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were, piled up 20 or 30 naked men, killed by starvation. General Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Another liberating soldier claimed, "We walked into a shed, and the bodies were piled up like wood. There is no other words to describe it." General Patton recounted in his diary that, in a shed was a pile of about 40 completely naked human bodies, in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purpose of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be about 200, the bodies were taken into a pit a mile from the camp, where they were then buried. The inmates claimed that 3,000 men, who had either been shot in the head or who had died from starvation, had been buried since the 1st of January. When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore they had some of the slaves exhume the bodies and place them on a mammoth griddle composed of 60-centimetre railway tracks laid on brick foundations. They poured pitch onto the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal underneath them. They were not very successful in their operations because there was a huge pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds. There were corpses everywhere, and the sights the American guards found inside the camp scarred their minds. But there were a few SS guards who had remained. The camp, as mentioned, had been almost completely evacuated, but there were some SS guards who were found, and these were then rounded up and were captured by the American forces. Most of the SS men had fled, but there were a few, for some reason, who had chosen to remain. Some may have even tried to masquerade as prisoners to save their own skin, like what happened inside other camps such as Bergen-Belsen. The SS guards had slaughtered a number of prisoners before they left, but the Americans did get their hands on a few of the guards. As the camp was liberated, US Army photographers captured the harrowing scenes and the bodies scattered everywhere. But they also photographed a number of bodies of SS guards who had been battered and killed. In one image there are 2 SS guards who seemingly look as if they're wearing civilian clothing or prisoner clothing, leading to the conclusion that these men remained at Ohrdruf to hide out amongst those who were still there. These 2 men had a harrowing final few moments, as it is clear they were battered and brutalised. They both have incredibly bruised and purple faces, which are heavily bloodied. It's likely that the US soldiers and liberators wanted to inflict some instant revenge for what happened at the camp and battered and brutalised these men beyond recognition. One of the SS guards has a huge lump on his forehead, and his head is completely purple. But also their bodies contain many bullet holes close to their heart, showing that they were killed and executed by the rifles or machine guns of probably the Americans. On one of the guards' bodies, there are at least 7 bullet holes close to the heart on the man's chest. Some of the wounds could have been done posthumously also, as soldiers carried out instant reprisal for what they had seen. The men's bodies were left out in the open, but this was just one example of a reprisal killing of the SS guards of Ohrdruf. Another SS guard who was at the camp was captured by prisoners, and he was subjected to very similar treatment. Those inmates who remained tore the clothes from his body and battered and beat him to a bloody pulp. Many of the American guards would have turned their back to this, and scattered around this man's body are a number of heavy stones and rocks, leading to the conclusion that he was probably battered to death by these weapons, being smashed over the head with them. This was the same for an SS guard of the camp who was set upon by Soviet prisoners, and his body lies in a ditch with rocks scattered all around him, his lifeless corpse still clothed, as he still had his boots on him. Another guard who was killed had a swastika carved into his chest, as his body was left on the ground, with prisoners and soldiers standing around him, and his head covered in pools of blood. There were a number of others, and there was also a female guard who was subjected to this sort of treatment. This woman was either killed by the prisoners of the camp or by the US liberators. Her remains were battered and bruised, and she appears to have been struck around the face repeatedly, as there are cuts and bruises on her face. There also appears to be a bullet wound in her stomach, and presumably another few bullet holes, leading to the conclusion that she was probably shot by US forces, as the prisoners did not have access to this weaponry. This unknown woman was one of the only female guards of the concentration camps, who when liberated was executed immediately by soldiers or by prisoners. The bullet holes indicate that it would have been US soldiers who at least finished this woman off. The excuse for this would have been that it was instant reprisal and revenge for the horrors they inflicted upon the prisoners. Today the only structures that remain of the Ohrdruf camp are some of the munitions bunkers, which were used to house a number of the inmates. The horrors that the US liberating forces found haunted the memory of those, and the images of the slaughter were printed all around the world, and in the final weeks of the Second World War, the evils of Ohrdruf and the SS cemented the terrifying actions of the Nazi Party, and that those liberators were fighting against evil. But the US forces did allow a number of brutal reprisals, and took part in some executions against the guards of the camp that they discovered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.